The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has warned Russia not to use a British citizen arrested on spying charges as a diplomatic pawn. A man in his 50s has been stabbed to death on a train in Surrey. President Trump has been meeting congressional leaders to try to resolve a row which has closed large parts of the US government for 2 weeks. 150 lorries are to take part in an exercise next Monday to test plans to avoid disruption at British ports in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Hackers have leaked the personal data of hundreds of German politicians and journalists, including the Chancellor, Angela Merkel. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has warned Russia against playing diplomatic chess games with people's lives after a man with dual British and American nationality was charged with spying in Moscow. Paul Whelan, who also holds an Irish passport, was detained a week ago, accused by the FSB security service of carrying out an act of espionage. The charge carries a maximum prison sentence of 20 years. The detention comes at a time of already strained relations between the Kremlin and the UK government, as our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports.
The arrest of Paul Whelan in Moscow last week began as a mystery, but it's now threatening to turn into a diplomatic standoff. The 48-year-old former US Marine, who's also a British citizen, is facing unspecified charges of espionage. One Russian news agency has made unconfirmed claims that when Mr. Whelan was detained by federal security officers in a Moscow hotel, he had just been passed a memory stick containing the names of local intelligence officials. His family say he is innocent and was in Moscow for a wedding. Jeremy Hunt said his officials had offered consular assistance but had yet to be granted access. The Foreign Secretary said he was extremely worried about Mr. Whelan, who he said should not be used as a pawn for diplomatic leverage.
We need to see what these charges are against him, understand whether there is a case or not. We are giving every support that we can, but we don't agree with individuals being used in diplomatic chess games.
There's been speculation that Mr. Whelan might have been arrested so he could be exchanged for a Russian woman who was jailed in the United States last month. Maria Butina, a pro-gun activist, admitted trying to influence US conservative groups on behalf of the Russian government, something Moscow denies. So far, the US response has been relatively cautious. But Mr. Hunt's robust warning shows that he at least remains willing to speak out against Moscow. Anglo-Russian relations, which are already poor following the Salisbury poisoning incident last year, seem unlikely to improve soon. Mr. Hunt said the Foreign Office was actively considering the safety of other Britons in Russia, and its travel advice was constantly under review.
Jeremy Hunt said the detention of Paul Whelan had been desperately worrying for his family. In a statement, they expressed their relief that American embassy officials in Moscow had been given consular access to him and appealed to the United States Congress and the State Department to help bring him home. Our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford has been finding out more about Paul Whelan and sent this report.
Paul Whelan has been interested in Russia for many years. In 2006, when he was serving with the US Marines in Iraq, he even chose to travel here for his 2 weeks annual leave. It was because of that local knowledge that his twin brother says he was invited to act as a kind of tour guide for a friend's wedding in Moscow late last month. An old web page run by Mr. Whelan describes another trip to Russia in 2008, which he calls the long-held dream of someone who grew up during the Cold War. The page is filled with photos of tourist sites, the Soviet cartoon character Cheburashka, and friends he met on his travels. They include those he'd made previously on social media sites, including the Russian equivalent of Facebook, VK. Two of those men have told me that they were shocked by his arrest. One described Paul Whelan as friendly and easygoing and fascinated by Russia and its culture. Other contacts do appear to have military connections, but again they say there was nothing suspicious in Mr. Whelan's conduct. If he's a spy, then I'm Michael Jackson. One man who has military imagery among his profile pictures wrote to me. All describe Paul Whelan's spoken Russian as basic at best, though he often posted comments in Russian on social media sites, apparently using an online translator.
A man has been stabbed to death on board a train in Surrey in what police have described as an incredibly frightening attack. The murder happened at lunchtime during a fight witnessed by other passengers. The suspect is thought to have got off the train at Clandon station. A big manhunt is now underway in the area. This report from Angus Crawford.
Emergency services were called to Horsley Station in Surrey just after 1:15 this afternoon, following reports of a stabbing. They found a passenger on a Guildford to London Waterloo service suffering from a knife wound. Despite the efforts of paramedics, he died at the scene. It's thought two men got on at Guildford's London Road station. One eyewitness said there'd been what he called a vicious fight in the carriage before the attacker got off at the next station, Clandon. The train continued on to Horsley, where the alarm was raised. Officers are searching fields in the area. British Transport Police has described it as a shocking attack in broad daylight and says extra patrols have been deployed. This is one of the busiest routes in the country, with more than 100 services a day to London. Trains are likely to be delayed, diverted or cancelled until at least 9 o'clock tonight.
President Trump has been meeting congressional leaders in an attempt to end the partial government closure, which has affected more than 800,000 workers across the United States. The shutdown began before Christmas after Mr. Trump demanded more than $5 billion to build a wall along the border with Mexico. The Democrats, who now control the House of Representatives, are refusing to fund the barrier. Mr. Trump says he will veto any budget which doesn't include the cash. From Washington, Gary O'Donoghue reports.
For the second time this week, congressional leaders travelled the 2 miles along Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House in a fresh attempt to end the 2-week-old standoff. Both sides are now so entrenched over the issue of the border wall, the space for compromise and mutual face-saving is growing ever narrower. The president is demanding $5 billion and threatening to veto anything else. The new House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, has said, "We're not doing a wall, so that's that." Earlier, the White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said the president wouldn't back down and attacked Nancy Pelosi's approach.
The people that elected Nancy Pelosi didn't elect her to come up here and do nothing, and didn't elect her to play political games. They elected her to find real solutions and actually work with the president and work with all members of Congress to get things done.
800,000 federal employees are not being paid at the moment, with almost half of them having to go to work anyway as they're deemed essential. Their next pay packet is due next Friday. Nevertheless, this is a partial shutdown, with mandatory spending such as social security checks still going out. Both Republicans and Democrats will be weighing carefully the potential political costs of keeping the shutdown going. If there is to be a deal at some point, it's likely to have to include Democrat demands for a permanent solution to the issue of young undocumented immigrants, whose status has been thrown into doubt after the president sought to end their temporary right to remain. But the party, emboldened by its new majority in the House, might feel they can demand even more from the president before they agree to any new funding for border security.
The US economy created more than 300,000 jobs in December, nearly twice as many as predicted. Shares on Wall Street rose sharply on the news, also boosted comments by Jerome Powell, the head of the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. Mr. Powell said he wouldn't resign if asked to by President Trump, who's been sharply critical of recent hikes in interest rates. Here's our economics correspondent, Andrew Walker.
Jerome Powell was President Trump's own choice for chairman of the Federal Reserve, the head of the country's central bank. But the president has taken exception to the decisions taken by the Fed under Mr. Powell. Last year, it raised interest rates 4 times. Mr. Trump has described the policy as a big mistake and the Fed as crazy and loco. There have been reports that he considered firing the Fed chairman, though it's not clear that he has the power to do so. Today, Mr. Powell took part in a panel discussion with his 2 predecessors and was asked by the moderator of the event about his relations with the president.
Have you received anything direct from the White House about unhappiness with the path of rates or discussion of any change in your job?
No, I've not. I have not. I have no news for you on that.
If the president asked you to resign, would you do it?
No.
Shortly before this event, the US government published its monthly report on the employment situation. It showed the largest rise in the number of jobs since February. Although most investors don't expect more increases in interest rates this year, a succession of equally strong labour market reports could change that and lead the Fed to take action that would further antagonise the president.
Theresa May has spoken by phone to the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker about her Brexit deal. Mrs May is trying to secure further reassurances from the EU, as well as shore up support at Westminster ahead of a Commons vote this month. But this morning, the Democratic Unionist Party, on which the government relies in key votes, warned that there was no way it could support the Prime Minister's agreement. More details from our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake.
On her return from the Christmas break, the Prime Minister has been confronted with a brutal reminder of the scale of the challenge she faces to get her Brexit deal approved by Parliament. There's little sign that Conservative or Labour MPs have changed their minds about voting against the plan when it comes before the Commons later this month. And the Prime Minister's supposed allies in the DUP appear to still be dead against the agreement. Despite a charm offensive, senior party members had lunch with Mrs May in Downing Street yesterday. There isn't much evidence of progress for Number 10. This morning, the DUP's Brexit spokesman Sammy Wilson said nothing they'd heard from Brussels had encouraged them to back the deal.
We're more alarmed at what is coming out from the EU and especially from the Irish government, who have made it quite clear that they do not see this as some temporary arrangement or some insurance policy. But in fact, Leo Varadkar has said within the last 2 weeks that he sees this as the settled arrangement.
Dozens of Tory MPs look set to vote against the deal regardless of any further assurances about what's called the backstop, which would prevent a hard border in Ireland if no trade deal was agreed. They're worried the government might agree a permanent trade deal that sees the whole of the UK staying close to the EU's regulations and customs arrangements. But the Prime Minister has continued her efforts to get more reassurances with calls to some of her European counterparts. This afternoon, a conversation with the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, was described as friendly.
The government is to test its plans for coping with border disruption in Kent if Britain leaves the EU without a deal. Up to 150 lorries will be involved in the exercise on Monday in the Ramsgate and Dover areas. The port of Ramsgate is being dredged to allow ferries to dock for the first time in years, a key element of the no-deal preparations. More details from Richard Lister.
The Port of Dover handles almost 5 million vehicles a year, more than half are heavy goods vehicles, which under EU rules require no customs checks. But a no-deal Brexit would mean inspecting all goods shipped from the continent, with the potential for significant disruption at Dover and the other Channel ports. The government's planning to use Ramsgate Harbour to take some of Dover's ferry traffic in the event of no deal. But Ramsgate hasn't handled a ferry service since 2013, and Rod Mackenzie from the Road Haulage Association says the fact that preparatory work there has only just begun is deeply concerning.
Only 60 days to go, and remember the traffic crowding into this port. The port isn't used to it, so there's all sorts of problems with a potential backlog, customs chaos, and lorries just congested all over Kent.
Mr Mackenzie also criticised the fact that Seabourn Freight, the company given the contract to operate ferries from Ramsgate, has never run a ferry service and has no ships. The Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, said Seabourn was on track to be ready by April. On Monday, the Department for Transport will test its plan for alleviating lorry congestion and the result of a no-deal Brexit. It will use Manston Airfield north of Dover as a staging post for up to 150 HGVs. The government said it doesn't want or expect a no-deal Brexit, but needs to prepare for all eventualities.
France is calling up police reservists and starting motorcycle patrols on beaches around Calais to try to prevent migrants from crossing the Channel to Britain. The measures are being introduced as part of a joint action plan agreed last week by the Home Secretary Sajid Javid and his French counterpart. A Royal Navy ship has been sent to the Dover Strait to patrol the waters until 2 Border Force cutters, currently in the Mediterranean, are redeployed. More details from our Paris correspondent, Lucy Williamson.
Of the 500 migrants who tried to cross the Channel in small boats last year, the UK says around 80% of them left between October and December. French officials agree that there's been a sharp rise in attempted crossings since October, and the two countries have agreed to strengthen policing. French reservists are being called up to reinforce police patrols along the coast, and helicopters are being used to support the Coast Guard so that the waters off Calais are monitored at all times. Fabienne Soudry, Commissioner for the local government in Calais, told the BBC that police would be equipped with off-road motorcycles and night vision goggles to patrol the dunes along the coast, and that security cameras and extra lighting would be installed at the port of Boulogne-sur-Mer, from where boats have been stolen. Mr Soudry said the arrest of 14 migrants on New Year's Eve showed that measures introduced since October were working, and that no migrants had been seen crossing the channel in the past couple of days. These crossings are very dangerous, Mr Soudry said. Our aim is to save lives and avoid a tragedy. But the numbers crossing by boat were dwarfed by the many thousands trying to cross in trucks, he said, and the main migration route remains the land.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far. The Foreign Secretary has told Russia not to use a British citizen arrested in Moscow on espionage charges in any diplomatic chess games. Police have launched a manhunt after a man in his 50s was stabbed to death on a train in Surrey. Still to come, the UK's latest big winners on the Euro Millions lottery express their disbelief.
Well, it must be more than £2.60. He won £2.60 the week before. And he said, no, you're misunderstanding me. We've won.
There's been a mixed reaction to new guidance which casts doubt on whether using screens is actually damaging for children. The Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health said there was insufficient evidence to suggest that time limits on the use of computers, smartphones and tablets are needed. Its guidance says parents are best placed to decide what's right for their child. Some have welcomed the advice as common sense, but others say it doesn't go far enough. Here's our medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh.
The Royal College drew up its advice after a comprehensive review of available evidence on the impact of screen time on children's health. That evidence is patchy and mostly looks at television rather than smartphones or computers. Does heavy screen use cause obesity and depression in children? There are many studies which suggest a link, but the Royal College says the evidence simply isn't strong enough to prove it. It says families should negotiate time limits with their children depending on how screen use impacts on sleep, physical and social activities. One professor of applied statistics called the advice admirably sensible and practical. Cherise Blackman from South London has 3 children aged 9 to 14. She says the guidance that children should not use screens in the hour before bed is already applied in her house.
I take everything away at bedtime. I take laptops, tablets, phones away just because there's no kind of distraction, no notifications, no pings, just completely take it away at bedtime. For me, it's really important. I think they need to get their rest. I do think that's something that young kids are struggling with, is getting adequate rest.
Lynn Knapp, headmistress of Windmill Primary School in Oxford, says modern technology can be damaging.
Social media and screen time can actually be quite detrimental to children's development because they're things that we see in school in terms of children's readiness for school when they're coming in when they're 5. If they've been put in front of a screen a lot, they don't have a vocabulary that they can come into school and then interact with other children with.
The Royal College admits that much more research is needed, especially on the impact of social media on the young. So its guidance will not be the last word on this contentious issue.
Up to 1,000 politicians, celebrities and journalists in Germany, including the Chancellor Angela Merkel, have fallen victim to what's being described as the country's biggest ever leak of personal data. The information was posted on Twitter last month in the style of an advent calendar, but was only discovered by officials yesterday. Our Berlin correspondent Damien McGuinness has the details.
Germany's political class has been hit by this attack. Letters to and from Angela Merkel have been hacked. Party leaders have seen their home addresses, mobile phone numbers, and even family photos and correspondence published online. Private bank statements and credit card details have also been made public. The only political party not affected is the right-wing populist Alternative for Germany, or AfD. Celebrities have also been targeted, including a famous comedian, an actor and a number of musicians. all of whom are renowned for being politically outspoken and critical of right-wing extremism. This has led an MP in Mrs Merkel's Conservative Party to accuse the far right of being responsible. Others believe the hackers might have links to Russia or China. But so far there is no evidence to support these theories. Germany's Justice Minister Katharina Barley said that no sensitive information had been leaked from the Chancellor's office, but stated that whoever is behind this wants to damage faith in our democracy ahead of key elections this year.
Holidaymakers have been advised to avoid areas of southern Thailand, which have been hit by a violent tropical storm. Conditions on the islands of Koh Samui, Koh Phangan and Koh Tao are said to be the worst they've been in 30 years. Our World Affairs editor John Simpson sent this report from his hotel in Koh Samui.
The rain's coming down in torrents as the force of superstorm Pabuk builds up. And the waves are getting bigger and bigger, 15 feet high in places. Koh Samui is in a state of silence and lockdown. It's late at night now. The streets and the small towns and villages are empty as they have been all day, and hotel guests have had warnings not to leave their rooms. Thousands of foreigners are still here, people who either didn't want to leave or couldn't get out on the last flight before Koh Samui airport was closed yesterday. There's a definite feeling of bravado among the foreigners I've talked to, but it probably covers a certain nervousness. No one here knows what's going to happen after all. According to the head of Thailand's meteorological department, this storm is huge.
The Prison Officers Association has admitted that a small minority of staff are involved in corruption after it emerged that gangsters are deliberately getting jobs in jails to smuggle in drugs. The Prisons Minister, Rory Stewart, who's pledged to cut drug-related violence in jails, said officers should be regularly searched to deter them from bringing in contraband. Our Home Affairs correspondent Danny Shaw reports.
The drugs trade in prisons is highly lucrative. It's controlled by organised criminal networks who sometimes bribe prison staff to bring in contraband. The National Police Chiefs Council says it suspects some gang members are finding jobs as maintenance workers or prison officers so they can smuggle drugs in themselves. It's a real threat, it says, that needs to be managed. The head of the Prison Officers Association, Mark Fairhurst, accepts corruption is a problem, but says it's rare, with less than 1% of staff involved.
People get recruited before they apply for a job by a criminal gang, and then obviously some staff get infiltrated while they're inside, and prisoners approach them, and depending on their personal circumstances, sometimes they go to the dark side and let us all down.
Mr Fairhurst says new recruits must be properly vetted before they're appointed. Rory Stewart says he's pushing for airport-style security in every jail in England and Wales to prevent smuggling. But the Prisons Minister says officers occasionally give in to temptation and bring drugs in for a criminal gang.
It can happen, and the answer to that is searching. Searching not just in terms of finding a bad apple, but also that if you have very good search procedures in place, it's much more difficult for a prisoner to put pressure on a prison officer.
To strengthen search procedures, X-ray scanners are being installed in 10 prisons to detect drug packages concealed inside a prisoner's body. But criminals are adept at finding ways to evade security. As one governor put it, it's a game of cat and mouse.
Labour has expelled an MP who lied to police to avoid a speeding charge and has repeated its call for her to resign her seat. Fiona Onesanya, who represents Peterborough, was convicted last month of perverting the course of justice and immediately suspended. Thousands of television licence fee payers have been sent fake emails by fraudsters trying to obtain their bank details. Action Fraud, which monitors cybercrime, says it's received more than 5,000 complaints since the beginning of October. It warned that the con was particularly nasty as it looks so convincing. Helena Lee reports.
This latest scam involves people being emailed telling them they're due a refund or that they need to keep up with their payments. A link within the body of the email appears to direct them to the official TV licensing website, but it's a fake version. Once there, people are asked to hand over payment details, including their bank account number and sort code. Detective Inspector Paul Carroll from the City of London Police says some victims also get a phone call.
You may receive a call from the fraudsters stating they're from your bank and asking you if you did receive what could potentially be a spoof email from TV licensing. They would then advise that they'll need to transfer their funds into a supposed safe account. This makes it a lot easier for the fraudster to retrieve all of their funds.
Action Fraud says the number of reports of this particular email scam has increased in each of the past 3 months. TV licensing said it would never email customers unprompted to ask for bank details or personal information.
Figures showing that the growth in house prices has nearly ground to a halt in many areas have prompted warnings about the uncertainty caused by Brexit. The Nationwide Building Society says the average price of a home grew by just 0.5% last year, although property in Northern Ireland and Wales did much better. Our personal finance correspondent Simon Gompertz has the details.
In quieter times, the state of the housing market depends on buyers' confidence about their finances and especially about their jobs. Right now, employment is at a record high and wages are rising on average faster than prices, both factors which should fuel competition for an inadequate supply of homes and push up prices. Yet the opposite is happening. Prices did rise across last year, but more slowly than figures in the summer and autumn implied, and London saw a fall of nearly 1%, with London's commuter belt dropping by almost 1.5%. It was different elsewhere. Yorkshire and the Humber up 3.7% last year, Wales up 4% and Northern Ireland up nearly 6%. But in just the month of December, the average UK house price fell, a development which Nationwide attributes to the uncertain economic outlook surrounding Brexit. One forecasting firm, the Ernst & Young Item Club, which uses the Treasury's model of the economy, reacted by predicting a disorderly departure from the EU could result in a 5% drop in house values. Nationwide is more cautious, suggesting that if and when the Brexit uncertainty clears, 2019 could see the rate of increase return to around 2% a year.
In the city, the 100 index closed up 146 points at 6,838. On Wall Street a short time ago, the Dow Jones was up 767 points at 23,453. On the currency markets against the dollar, the pound was up 0.9 cents at $1.27.1. Against the euro, the pound was also up 0.9 cents at €1.11.5, making a euro worth 89.7 pence. A couple from Northern Ireland say they're looking forward to sharing their good fortune after winning almost £115 million in the Euro Millions lottery draw. Francis and Patrick Connolly from Moira in County Down won the prize on New Year's Day. The pair, both in their 50s, used to work in business development and as a teacher. They're now planning a holiday to Mauritius where they'll consider their next move. Our island correspondent Chris Page has been to meet them.
Keep taking it! Yay! Keep smiling!
It's the happiest of New Year's for Francis and Patrick Connolly, the winners of the fourth biggest lottery prize ever awarded in the UK. Francis was knitting a jumper at home when Patrick told her their numbers had come up.
And so I just turned the computer around to her and said,
I think I've got some good news for you. And I could see the lottery ticket up and I thought, well, it must be more than £2.60. He won £2.60 the week before. And I thought he was going to say, I've got £1,000 or something. He said, no, you're misunderstanding me. We've won.
After celebrating with a hug and a cup of tea, their first thought was that they would share their win with friends and family, not least their 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren.
The only thing we've done is make a list of all the people we're going to give money to. And it sounds unselfish to be giving it away, but it's going to be so much fun.
The couple say they've never been poor, but have had everyday financial worries. Now they're planning to replace their Renault, buy a new bungalow and go to watch the Monaco Grand Prix. At their news conference, one reporter asked if they were now concerned about their personal security. Frances said she hadn't considered it.
I've never met anybody I wouldn't take down myself, to be fair.
Patrick and Frances have started 2019 by becoming fabulously wealthy in just a few seconds. But they're most looking forward to making some other people into millionaires with their cash giveaways.
The headlines again. The Foreign Secretary has rebuked Russia following the arrest of a British citizen on spying charges. Jeremy Hunt said Moscow shouldn't use individuals as pawns in a game of diplomatic chess. A man's been stabbed to death on a train in Surrey in front of passengers travelling between Guildford and London Waterloo. Leaders of the US Congress are meeting President Trump to try to end the deadlock which has caused a partial government closure. Shares have risen sharply following stronger than expected job figures from the United States. There are calls for more research into the impact of technology on young children after health experts said there was no evidence that using mobiles and computers was in itself a bad thing. BBC News.